Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that applications are now open for the August cohort of the Documentary Life Mastermind. If you're working on a documentary and looking for a supportive community of fellow nonfiction filmmakers to share your work with, receive honest feedback, and stay accountable throughout the filmmaking process, I would love to invite you to apply. Groups are intentionally kept small to encourage meaningful conversation and connection. To learn more and submit a brief application, visit barongfilms.com/mastermind. Last episode, as we opened this new season of the Documentary Life, I shared one of the lower moments of my documentary life. After 7 years of making Elvis of Cambodia, we'd run out of money. We were about a month away from not being able to pay our rent or our children's school fees. And I found myself questioning not only the film, but whether this documentary life I'd spent years talking about was actually sustainable. After a moment like that, something changes. I don't mean in a dramatic way. There's no clarity, there's no breakthrough. And the changing, as I mentioned previously, it wasn't overnight. It was just a quiet realization that if I'm going to keep doing this, I need to understand how our films actually get funded. Because up until that point, I thought funding worked a certain way. You apply, you pitch, you get a yes. Which reminds me of a moment years earlier when we had temporarily moved down to Long Beach, California, our 6-week headquarters from which we would launch a 30-day Kickstarter campaign to raise $20,000 so we could begin filming in Cambodia. And one of the very first contributions we received was for $500. And it was from someone we didn't even know. And that kind of stopped us, because $500 is not casual, especially from a stranger. So we set up a call, and what was supposed to be a quick conversation turned into 45 minutes. He told us about his connection to Cambodia, about his interest in the music, in the culture, the instruments he had spent time studying. He was a musician himself. And when he heard about the film, he wanted to be a part of it. And I remember getting off that call and realizing something had shifted. The film felt different. It felt more real and more grounded and more connected to people. Because it was no longer just something we were trying to make. It was something other people were beginning to believe in. And over the course of that campaign, more people showed up. And that same donor, the one we didn't know, he kept contributing. Eventually, he gave $3,000 to our project. Not because we convinced him, but because he believed in the film, and he wanted to be a part of it. And that was the first time I understood something about funding that I hadn't understood before. It is not just about money. It's about relationship. It's about trust. And whether you realize it or not, it changes the film. Because the moment someone contributes, especially in a meaningful way, they're not just supporting the project. They're entering into it. They're bringing their own history, their own connection, their own reasons for wanting this story to exist. And now you're carrying that with you. Not in a heavy way, but in a more real way. You start to understand that the film isn't just yours anymore. And it never really was. It's something that's being held up by other people, by their belief in it, by their willingness to stand behind it. And that changes how you see the work. It changes how you move through it. Because now the question isn't just, how do I get this film funded? It becomes, what does it mean to invite people into this story? There's a version of funding we all imagine when we start. Clean, structured, straightforward. And then there's the version you actually experience. Welcome back to the Documentary Life. This is a show about how to live and lead your own documentary life. I'm your host, Chris G. Parkhurst, and this is episode number 142, How Do I Fund My Film? How do I fund my film is the most common question documentary filmmakers asked, and often the least honestly answered. This episode looks beyond grants lists. pitch decks, and success stories to examine what funding actually does to a documentary project once it enters the room. How money shapes creative decisions, how timelines, power dynamics, and expectations quietly shift, and how filmmakers are rarely prepared for the emotional and ethical weight that comes with being funded. In this conversation with Liz Nord, we talk about funding not as a finish line, but as a set of conditions filmmakers must learn to navigate, often without guidance. We explore hybrid funding realities, sustainability beyond a single project, and how to think strategically without losing clarity or authorship. This is not an episode about shortcuts or guaranteed paths. It is about understanding the terrain so you can make decisions with your eyes wide open. For independent documentary filmmakers trying to fund work responsibly and live with the consequences, this episode is for you. Before we get to today's conversation, I wanted to let you know about something I've put together that I genuinely wish someone had handed me when I first started making documentaries. It's called the Documentary Life Field Guide, a collection of lessons, reflections, and practical insights drawn from more than 25 years of making nonfiction films. It's about storytelling, sustainability, funding, interviews, creative life, and learning how to build a life around documentary filmmaking that's both meaningful and sustainable. Now, you can download it for free by visiting thedocumentarylife.com. Just enter your email address and I'll send it straight to your inbox. And remember, stories matter, listening matters, human connection matters. Liz Nord is head of programs and creative development at the NYU Production Lab, where she runs the feature film development studio and designs opportunities that launch emerging filmmakers' careers. Previously, she served as director of content at Sundance, helping grow Sundance Collab into a major global learning platform, and was editor-in-chief and lead producer at No Film School, overseeing one of the world's largest filmmaking publications and co-hosting the Indie Film Weekly podcast. She has interviewed hundreds of filmmakers and mentored artists through programs including Latino Public Broadcasting, the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and the What Jewish Writers Initiative, and is a founding member of Film Fatales. As a filmmaker and producer, Nord directed the documentary Jericho's Echo, Punk Rock in the Holy Land, which screened internationally, and produced projects ranging from MTV's award-winning Choose or Lose '08 election coverage to documentary work in Haiti for Yele Haiti. She frequently speaks at festivals and conferences including Sundance, Tribeca, Doc NYC, South by Southwest, and TED Talks, and has long been involved in media education and literacy initiatives, reflecting a career centered on supporting storytellers as both a creator and an advocate for emerging voices. It's lovely to have you joining us today, Liz, on The Documentary Life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. It was so nice to hear that intro and, think, wow, I've done some stuff, I guess.
I made you sound great, didn't I? So, a core question that we're going to kind of really get into kind of revolves around how do documentary filmmakers realistically fund their films today? And it's beyond myth, prestige, pathways, or one-off wins. And why this, particular episode matters this is the single, not surprisingly, this is the single most frequently asked questions that we receive. And it's also one of the most poorly and romantically answered one in the community, quite frankly. Most of us doc filmmakers, we're taught how to apply for grants, how to pitch, how to celebrate funding wins, but we're rarely taught things like, how funding actually comes together over time. How many films are underfunded by design? How to survive, the gaps between granting.
Right.
How to think about funding as an evolving system, not simply as a moment. So if we can kind of reframe an intro question, I'd love to ask, when filmmakers ask, how do I fund my film? What does someone like yourself hear beneath that question that they may not be saying out loud?
That's interesting. That's an interesting way to frame it. And I already have so many thoughts about what you've said because, it's true that films require funding. We are an art form that needs some funding, and that can be a huge range in terms of what that means. But we tend to avoid the conversation, and yet it is an essential part of our work. So I'm so glad that you've brought this up. And I also just wanted to respond to one other piece about how, like you were saying, the way it's talked about can be really weird and like off-putting. And that just brought me back to really early in my career. I'm veering off a little, but it's related in that I took a fundraising class early in my career, not at school, but at a like a filmmaking foundation in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And it was called Shaking the Money Tree, which was based on a
Maury.
book. Yep.
Good old Maury. We've had Maury on the program.
So you know it. So the
Yeah.
thing is, essentially the idea is that it's about how to ask people for money, which is still really relevant, and everyone needs to know how to do it. But in the class, the whole premise was like, you have to know rich people, and then you get their support on your projects, which is one of the valid ways to raise money. But I was really young and, didn't come from a privileged background. And I raised my hand and said, well, what if you don't know any wealthy people? And the answer was, get to know them. And I'm like, that is not useful, So
Yeah.
I think I just want to underscore how glad I am that we're having this conversation. And and in terms of the question under the question, when people ask how to fund my films, I think there are aspects of this industry where you really need to ask the question under the question, especially why are you making this film? It's one of those ones where it's useful to almost ask 5 times, because the first time they say something kind of surface, and then the more you ask, like, you finally get to the real answer of why they're making whatever film they're making. In terms of funding, I tend to find it a little bit more straightforward. Like folks need money to fund their films, and they're trying to figure it out. The challenge comes more on the answer side, as you've pointed out. Like, I find that question pretty straightforward. How do I fund my film? Well, right, that's the thing you need to do. But the answer, I think, is more complicated and maybe more possible than people think. Like, if you think outside the box and if you piece together multiple pieces, what I mean by that is that few films are funded from a single source. So it often has to do with putting a puzzle together of these different possible pieces. And so maybe if there's a question under the question, it's what are all the possible ways I could fund my film?
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Funding changes the film. It can potentially change the film, right? It often does. At what point does funding stop being support and start becoming a shaping force, potentially on the film itself?
I would hope that doc filmmakers are still, focusing on ethical practice in general, and that they would be doing everything they can to not have their funding sources be shaping the direction of their films. And so part of that is having discussions really early on with your funders and financiers about the boundaries that you're setting. So I think it can happen in a lot of ways, particularly if there are these individual investors who sometimes might feel entitled to have some weigh-in on the outcome of the film, whereas a granting organization might have a more, like, they would be more sophisticated about what it means to fund a film, and they wouldn't expect to have an influence on the outcome of the film. And, if you do crowdfunding, which is now such a major, major piece of film funding, crowdfunding is funding more films in the U.S. than the National, Arts Association is, or the various national organizations, which are all disappearing anyway. If you crowdfund, then I don't think, people who've contributed to your crowdfunding don't expect to have like an influence on the film. So I feel like where it can get most tricky is if, let me put it this way. I think it is the responsibility of the filmmaker, of us as filmmakers, to make sure that the content of our films is not being influenced by anyone outside. And that might be in terms of funding, or, there's often a slippery slope when the subject of the film or the child of the subject of the film is also an executive producer. You see that a lot. And as soon as I see that on a credit, in credits, the red flag goes up, like, how accurate is this portrayal? Or was it influenced by such and such who gave the permission? Because a big piece is funding. But another thing we have to secure, of course, as filmmakers is rights to certain material, archival material or legacy material or the estate of someone, especially if you're doing like a biopic. And so that's another area that sort of has to do with something that you need, like funding, to make the film happen. You need the material, but you have to make sure to set the boundaries so that who's ever providing you with access to that material does not have an undue influence on the film.
Why do you think so many filmmakers believe there's a single sort of, and I put this in quotes, correct funding pathway? And what do you think gets lost when they organize their project around that particular belief?
Yeah.
Because you must see that and often.
I see that a lot. And, I also work in the fiction space, and it's really similar. Like, filmmakers tend to believe there's one way. And part of that is because that's what they were told, or that's what they've seen examples of. Funny enough, as you mentioned, I used to run a website called No Film School. I didn't go to film school, and yet I now work essentially at a film school at NYU. And I will say that, it's such an incredible program here. I mean, you can't believe how many quote unquote successful filmmakers have been turned out from the programs here.
Yeah.
But they're not really learning in school the realities of a film life, of producing life. They learn to hone their voice and hone their craft and how to tell a story. And that's what's at the heart of what we do, of course. But there's this whole other part, which I think you focus on in the podcast, many episodes, of like how to actually be a working artist in the world. And I think if you've had formal film training, it often hasn't included a lot of information about this essential piece. So you only learn about maybe a little bit about grants. There's one class session on grants, or you don't really learn about, for example, something that still feels mysterious a little bit to me, even though I've been working in this space for a long time, is how foreign pre-sales work and co-productions. That's a whole aspect to this. I also think there may be some willfully not wanting to know. Like, filmmakers just want to make the film, and that's understandable. You just want to make the film. You don't really want to know about the 50 potential avenues for funding it, because each one of them takes its own whole amount of work. But we have to educate ourselves, because, again, it's so rare that films are funded in one single way. And even then, within the pieces that they know about, there's so much to learn. So I don't want people to feel daunted, but it's just, I think the hard side of the coin is like, oh my God, there's so much to learn, there's so much to do. The good side of the coin is that there actually are a lot of pathways to funding, and even within some of the traditional ways like grants, there's so many grants, and there are grants that are like very niche. So you might never be able to even apply for a Sundance grant. That's might feel too high to reach, but there may be a grant that's like very specific to the niche topic that you're covering in your film, and actually you're one of 4 people who qualify. So there are pathways within the pathways, but all of this takes so much kind of research and knowledge and learning from your peers. I think a really easy way to start is to look at films that are similar to what you're interested in making or what you're making, and look through their credits and see who supported them, and start there.
So we were talking about this idea of the myth of the right path, right? So filmmakers believing that there's a single correct funding pathway. What are some of the more common pathways that you believe doc filmmakers think are the correct funding pathways? Throw out some of the more common ones.
Well, I don't want to imply that they're incorrect. It's just that it may take a combination of things. Like grants are still the major funding source for documentaries. Even major production companies are trying to get the same grants, which actually makes it, harder for you and me to get them. Of course, they're great in that you don't have to pay them back. They're not investments. They're challenging in that they're so competitive and the timeline can be so long, as you alluded to earlier. I think everybody knows about crowdfunding now. Again, it's so major. But I think what they don't necessarily think about is like how to be strategic about the crowdfunding. So it's not necessarily a great like middle funding piece. It's kind of a good place to start the film. Kickstarter is called Kickstarter for a reason. Or to sort of end, to be able to say, hey, just get us to the finish line. But also that crowdfunding itself has its whole own strategy and takes, it requires planning and execution. But the good news is that there's so many resources online about that now. Like you can easily find guides on how to do a successful crowdfunding campaign. So again, I think everybody knows about these funding sources. They just don't necessarily know, like the piece that we don't talk as much about is how to put these different pieces together. So anyway, grants, crowdfunding, broadcast is changing. That used to be such a major way that that documentary filmmakers, especially more established ones, would pre-sell to a broadcaster so that they would already know that where they were being distributed and that money would go towards making the film. That's still pretty common, like with foreign entities or with co-productions. I think donations is still a major piece as well. We talked about shaking the money tree. If you do know those rich people, that's a way that I think people realize they can go. But the part they may not realize is that the incentive for wealthy entities to give you money in that way is to get a tax write-off. Right. So they're more likely to get some money back as a tax write-off than they would be for an investment, since unfortunately docs don't tend to make a lot of money for investors or filmmakers. So, on the donation front, it's like you have to either be a nonprofit or have a fiscal sponsor, meaning a nonprofit that sort of takes you under their wing and manages the donations part for you so that the donor can get the write-off. And then there's just, old-fashioned equity investment, which is less common in docs, but it's becoming more common. And the drawback there is that you have to pay them back, but the plus is that you got the money to make the film. So
why do you think it's becoming a bit more? I think I know the answer here, but I'm curious why you would say it's becoming a bit more common now.
I think depending on what kind of doc you're making, even though I said before docs don't make a lot of money, they don't. Yeah. But there are types of docs that are making money these days, and there was kind of a doc craze for a minute there, especially with true fiction and during the pandemic and everyone's home watching stuff. So I think some investors got a little bit savvier to docs and saying, oh, these aren't as expensive as fiction films to make, and some of them do actually make some return on their investment. So that's part of it. And I think as much as there are so many grants, there's also so many more people making films. So the grants have gotten more competitive. So I think doc filmmakers have just started realizing they could try for equity investment and are just trying that as an alternative to grants. So I think that's my guess. What do you think?
Yeah. I think that's probably true. I think you brought up true crime. That's obviously massive in streaming platforms. I think during COVID times, people were consuming content like mad. And in particular, documentaries, the popularity of documentaries in the past 6, 7, 8 years have skyrocketed. So I'm sure that's obvious. Just pure popularity, I think, is probably forced the hand in some ways, or brought that more to investors' attention. So let's just say that. So I think you're absolutely right.
And I should say, speaking of streaming docs, that what I am in kind of, and I think we've been referring to this whole time, are independent documentaries. Like
True.
docs that are like one-offs that filmmakers are trying
Yeah,
to,
yeah, yeah.
create versus something that was initiated by a Netflix because they know that it's gonna, hit their algorithm correctly or whatever. And
Yeah,
that's great too.
right.
I'm glad that doc filmmakers are getting work, through means like that. But
Right.
it's the indie space that is, always sort of harder to figure out the funding path in.
If you have ever found yourself asking, how am I going to pay for this documentary? You are most definitely not alone. You've got the vision, you've got the story, but finding the funding to actually bring that story to life, it can feel pretty overwhelming. And that's exactly why I wanted to tell you about the Doc Funding Hub from Desktop Documentaries. Led by award-winning documentary filmmakers Jillian Spitzmiller and Hank Rogerson, the Doc Funding Hub is designed to help documentary filmmakers build real fundraising skills, from grants and donors to community funding and much more. Members receive monthly live webinars, twice monthly funding alerts, access to a growing library of more than a year's worth of past funding sessions, and immediate access to the funding essentials for your documentary course. And because you're a listener of The Documentary Life, you can receive 50% off your first 2 months by visiting desktop-documentaries.com/TDL. Again, that's desktop-documentaries.com/TDL. You'll also find the link in the show notes for this episode.
So most films today are funded through sort of it's called patchwork, right? And more patchwork, less purity. So how should filmmakers think about hybrid funding strategically, rather than apologetically, shall we say?
Mm, yeah. Oh, that's such an interesting framing too, because I do think somehow we're taught to like apologize for asking for money, and
Yes, that's right.
we have to get over it. I don't know what else to say. We have to get
Yeah.
over it. Um, I, I was kind of alluding to this earlier, but I think it's about the timing of these different pieces and kind of figuring out what the potential timeline of each of your potential funding sources is, and then working backwards from there. So like if you've applied to, X number of grants, and that's the sort of easiest place to start because you know when you'll find out. Like usually you'll know around when they're going to announce.
Yeah.
So you can apply and, assume that you might get one or two and then think, okay, but I have 6 months until then. How can I fill in those gaps? And again, like crowdfunding might make sense at different times. Part of the reason I mentioned crowdfunding is a good place to start is because you won't have a lot of other material yet, and there are so few seed funders. There are some grants like Catapult that are designed
Yeah.
specifically to like help you launch, but it's a lot harder to start with nothing. So crowdfunding can kick you off. And the other good thing about that is that then you can show other potential funders, hey, 500 people have already, gotten on board with this and are waiting for this film to come out. And I think it's
Right.
encouraging for you as the filmmaker to know that you have now like built up this whole support network who are going to follow the progress of the film and sort of hold you accountable for making it and be there when it's done. So there's like a lot of strategy around the timing of that. In terms of donations, you take them, or investment, like take them whenever you can get them.
Let's talk about, this is, and this is in particular for doc filmmakers, sustainability versus survival. How can filmmakers distinguish between funding choices that help them finish, say their current film versus choices that undermine their ability to keep making work at all?
Yeah, I'm glad that this is a topic that has been coming up more in our world, along with documentary ethics and with mental health. Like these are things that weren't talked about as much when I was starting out, and they're all so important now. And I see them as all related, which is why I'm kind of bringing them up.
Absolutely.
The sustainability piece is so tricky, and everyone I know is dealing with it. Like I know there are very few people who are full-time independent documentary filmmakers, and there's a reason for that. It's because it's not that sustainable. And I should also say, I mentioned before that we're talking about indie filmmakers. I'm really here based in the US and talking about being a filmmaker in US. This is different in Europe or some countries where there are national funds that support this kind of work. So in the US, there are not so many full-time documentary filmmakers, and I- I'm stumped for words because it's such a it's kind of a painful topic. So many people I know who are so talented, like, cannot make ends meet in this field. But I think the creativity that we have as artists does serve us in this way, the same way it serves us to think outside the box about funding and what are some pathways that might not be as typical. I think we can think about how to put our lives together to make this happen in creative ways. A lot of people teach, people do commercial work to offset the other work. I think one of the nice things about
This guy
yeah,
does.
yeah, we all do. I mean, that's, I'm here at my full-time job at NYU,
That's right.
where, I'm supporting so many filmmakers, and that's really gratifying. But I also miss doing my own work, I'm not going to lie. And balancing that and figuring out the time for that is still tricky for me after all this time. So yeah, figuring out that balance of how can I make it work, it just takes our creative muscles. I think the nice thing about docs is that, unlike in fiction films, you don't necessarily have to be there all the time. So it does make it a little bit more possible to figure out a lifestyle where you can make some money, then work on your doc, or, you can be working on a commercial gig while you have a shooter capturing footage of your, participants at the same time, and you don't necessarily have to be there because that work might happen in the edit. So in some ways, there's a flexibility piece which we can use to our advantage.
Yes.
But the other piece about this sustainability, it's not just financial sustainability, it's like emotional well-being, sustainability in that way. And again, that's being talked about more. We are often, as documentary filmmakers, dealing with traumatic subjects and things that are really difficult and things that are happening in the world. And we're, in order to get someone to bare their souls to us, I think we have to be also vulnerable to them, or at least that's when I found it to be most effective. And so we're being vulnerable, like we're hearing or witnessing things that might be really difficult, and we need to take care of ourselves in that aspect as well.
That's absolutely right. Let's talk about saying no to money. And now let's talk about saying no to money.
Yeah.
Is there a moment when turning down funding is the more responsible choice? And if so, how can filmmakers recognize that moment without romanticizing it?
I'm so glad you asked this. I work with so many emerging filmmakers, and I think especially when you're like young and hungry, you are so ready to jump at every chance. A lot of the filmmakers I work with, it's like the first offer that comes in the door, they're like salivating over it. And I get that. Of course, you want to make this thing happen. You've dedicated your life to it. But just like they sometimes say, a director-producer relationship is like a marriage. You're going to be with this person for years. The same can be true of financiers. So I think that or financial partners, whatever they look like. So I think you want to be like really careful because you're going to be with this person on this, or this entity on this whole journey. So I really think vetting is important. Like, do you trust them? Do you trust them to not, what we were talking about earlier, to not try to give undue influence to the direction of your project? Have they done this before? Do they know what they're getting into? If they don't, can you educate them and have like a real conversation with them about what it means to get involved with your project and what they can and can't do? If you can't have an open line of communication with a potential funder, if you feel uncomfortable talking to them, like that's a bad sign. And I would reconsider, or just at least make sure they're not the only one. I think that's the other thing is like, if you can put together a group of funders, or as we've discussed now a few times, like put together different pieces, then it doesn't sort of give all the leverage to one party. who says, well, like what you don't want is you're working on this film for 3 years and you're dependent on one person and they, for whatever reason, kind of pull the plug. Like that would be terrible.
Right. I think what we're talking about is getting filmmakers to treat funding less like a transaction and more like a long-term relationship, right?
Oh,
And then
that's
learning
nailed it.
what the boundaries are necessary for that to work.
Same with your participants, in a way. Like you have a relationship with these people who are in your film, and you need to be in communication with them and have a shared understanding of like where you're going with this thing and that you're in it together.
So Liz, as a closer, I'd like to ask, if a doc filmmaker listening today is overwhelmed, underfunded, what's one way they could reframe the funding question that would actually give them agency back?
Hmm. Well, the first thing I would say is if you're feeling overwhelmed and underfunded, you're not alone. And I recommend reaching out to other doc filmmakers, to being part of this community, listening to this podcast, start a doc group in your area. Like, it's really important to commiserate, to share ideas, to share funding sources with other filmmakers. I believe in that so strongly. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, do your research. That's really important. Figure out who's funding films like yours. Get in touch. It never hurts to ask. I find people, especially emerging filmmakers, get a little bit overwhelmed or feel kind of icky about the ask, about pitching, about even taking kind of meetings with potential investors. And, bluntly, I would say you just got to get over that hump. But I think, to your question, a way to reframe it or to think about it is that you are a storyteller. We are storytellers. So if you kind of think of this as another opportunity for storytelling, that I can, pitching my film is really talking about why I'm passionate about it and getting people to understand the story. Every time I talk about a story I'm working on, I actually understand the story better. It's like in having to articulate it, you are getting down to the essence of the film.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
I think if you put pitching in or pitching or approaching financiers in that same bucket of like, I'm sharing my passion for this project, that just might help make it feel a little bit more palatable.
Liz, this has been a fantastic conversation. What have we missed? Do you have any parting thoughts for our dog filmmaking audience that maybe I haven't gotten to today?
Well, I agree. It's been a lovely conversation. And I guess I would say that writing grants applications is such a pain. We all know it's a pain. It takes a long time. It's kind of tedious. But again, with that kind of reframing, I think it's a really, really useful exercise. And now there's this kind of core application where many, many granting organizations are using essentially the same core application. You can find it online. And so it takes some of the, less time in a way because you don't have to keep redoing it. And there's something really useful about putting it together. It's useful for you to be able to articulate your project and what it's going to need and figure out where the holes are. And you can use that information and material, not just for funders, but like you're going to have to get a lot of people on board for your project, collaborators, participants, potential distributors, film festivals. So like it actually serves you really well to do that work, even though it's maybe a little bit less of the fun work for people. And I would also say I just want to encourage everyone to keep going for it. In these times, we need this material out there. Doc filmmakers are so often the best people I know, the best people I meet, like such well-intentioned people, and their voices need to be heard. So, you can do it. People do it all the time with a lot or a little funding. And I want to tell everyone to keep going for it.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us today on The Documentary Life.
Truly a pleasure. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode along with links and resources we discussed at thedocumentarylife.com. And if you haven't yet downloaded the Documentary Life Field Guide, you'll find that there too. It's a free resource designed to help you become a stronger documentary storyteller. And if you're looking for a supportive community of fellow documentary filmmakers to help you stay accountable, gain creative feedback, and keep your project moving forward, applications are currently open for the Documentary Life Mastermind. You can learn more and apply at barongfilms.com/mastermind. If today's conversation resonated with you, I'd love to continue it over on YouTube. Just search for The Documentary Life, where you'll find episode clips, conversations, and more. And if you enjoy what we're building there, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, remember, stories matter, listening matters, human connection matters.